Please be advised that the following episode discusses material regarding sexual assault, which may be a trigger for some people and therefore not suitable for all listeners.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak. Is the issue of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the glove?
A second wave is...
We all need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand.
From Santa Rosa, California, this is 19 Stories. I'm Cheryl Halling. My guest, Jorge Antonio Renaud, is the National Criminal Justice Director for Latino Justice, formerly known as the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, a New York-based national civil rights organization with the goal of changing discriminatory practices via advocacy and litigation. He has a BS in psychology from Sam Houston State University, a Master of Social Work from the University of Texas at Austin, was the 2020 Poet-in-Residence for the Civil Rights Corps, is the 2021 Writer-in-Residence for the Texas After Violence Project, and Policy Analyst for the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. After being arrested at the age of 20, thrown into jail, then beaten and sexually assaulted, he was arrested 2 additional times for armed robbery and spent a total of 27 years in prison. Caged for the last time in 1991, Jorge was released in July of 2008. He is serving the rest of his 60-year sentence for robbery on parole. He is a prison abolitionist with one paramount tenet: no human is disposable. I'd like to welcome Jorge Antonio Renaud to 19 Stories.
Hi, glad to be here.
Really appreciate you taking the time because I know you have a lot of work on your hands. And given you live in Austin, Texas, and so much is happening in your state, which we kind of referred to during a little bit of our conversation prior to this podcast, both politically and with the increase of COVID cases and hospitalizations, curious how you're holding up in the midst of all of this.
You do it with community. I've been in Austin on and off between sentences since the late 70s. And Austin had this reputation as a liberal oasis, right, in a really conservative state. And while it likely still is that, that's not really saying much. It's very much dominated now by entrepreneurs, by venture capitalists, by condominium construction companies, with the occasional, well, not the occasional, there's 53,000 students at the University of Texas. Musicians and poets, but it's rapidly being gentrified. And what made it really cool and special and different is kind of going by the wayside. You can get overwhelmed with despair if you don't take the time to get in your kayak and go down a town lake and just kind of sit by yourself for a while. This last weekend, I spent 2 really hard days building an aluminum covered deck for my girlfriend. And this coming weekend, Labor Day weekend, I'm hosting a cookout for In the Exception, right? I'm part of a group, the Abolish Slavery National Network, that we're trying to focus attention on the fact that the 13th Amendment did not, as a bunch of us grew up thinking, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves. Yeah, he freed the slaves except those who were duly convicted. And of course, they were immediately put into cages and then leased out usually to the same plantation owners who owned them. So we're trying to pay attention to that, but the cookout will be fun, and we'll play some bocce ball and some cornhole and some darts. And it's hard because everyone that I hang around with is either an activist or involved in the movement in some way. And sometimes you just want to get a trashy book and just sit down and just forget about it, right? But I find myself reading, Coelho. I find myself going back to, we do this till we free us or something, and just because the hope and the optimism that I find there is something that I need. So, yeah, you just do what you can.
Yeah, you do what you can. And you mentioned some key points of community and hope and optimism. But I absolutely understand that when you get in your community of like-minded, passionate people, it's hard to turn that off because that's your world. That's what you do. And I reached out to you and I became aware of you and the work you're doing through a piece that aired on PBS. where you not only shared your very poignant poetry expressed from your time in prison, but you said several things that really spoke to me. And again, that's why I reached out to you for you to share a bit of your story and the work you're doing. But prior to talking about what those were, I'd like to know about how your family settled in Texas, given you have this beautiful French surname, which goes back to early settlement in Louisiana.
Yeah, although my sisters or somebody may take me to task on this. From my understanding, my father's family came over from Louisiana in the early 1800s. Of course, Texas was still not a state nor a nation. It was probably owned by either Spain or France or whoever was owning it at the time. It was part of Mexico. And they settled in a little town that is now pretty well dust and tumbleweeds called San Perlita, which is down in the Rio Grande Valley next to Raymondville and part of the Southern King Ranch. Strangely enough, my father, who was denied a bunch of other identities, was always fiercely proud of saying that he was born on the King Ranch. My mother came over at 15. She crossed the Rio Bravo. Other people know as the Rio Grande. At 15, she had left.
At 15, wow.
Yeah, she'd been married to a much older guy who was really abusive. I had always thought that most Chicanos, which I am both, I think ethnically and politically. Ethnically, I say, Mexican-American, a child of individuals who are from Mexico is pretty well considered to be Chicano, but a lot of people reject that label because of the politicization that occurred in the 70s, right? With La Raza Unida, the Chicanos. But, I mean, a bunch of Mexican-Americans are very conservative politically. It's not something that I think is anything new to anybody listening. But I found out a couple of months ago that my daughter had taken a DNA test and that she was like 25% northern Apache from northern Mexico. And I had always heard that my mother was Chiricahua Apache, almost full blood. And so now I have to go spend the money to get my DNA test and find out how much I am. Because I know she got it from me because her mom was white. I mean, my daughter's, my ex-wife was white, 99% either Irish or Celtic or whatever it is that they come from, from the United Kingdom. So, yeah, so that's but my family. My father was a rancher. He met my mom, I think, he was 10 years older than her. They somehow settled in the Panhandle, in the Texas Panhandle, where most of his kids were born, except for me. My mother was 7 months pregnant. They somehow ventured into New Mexico for some reason, and I was born in New Mexico, which gives me a bit of cachet with some of the folks there when I go visit, because in New Mexico, everyone believes that they're descended directly from the conquistadores, and so they call me home. But yeah, my father was he all he ever wanted to do was be a farmer, and he had a farm. He was a overseer of the farm in West Texas, in a little town called Olton. That's in between Lubbock and Amarillo. And he had a handshake agreement with the owner of the farm that after 10 years he would get so many acres, and he was fired after like 9.5. Set us on this odyssey of chasing crops. When I was about 9 till I was about 11, 12, we went all over Texas, chasing watermelons, onions, cucumbers, cabbage, till we finally settled in Beeville, down in South Texas.
I'm not familiar with Beeville, but
but the people from Beeville. I mean, it's not like you're supposed to know where Beeville is. Come on.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to even pretend that I know where Beeville is, but. I literally went on that journey with you when you were explaining everything. It sounds like the land that your dad had and that you initially were on, that it was really beautiful. And how devastating to be fired. Was that an intentional firing so that the owner didn't have to honor his handshake?
I try not to speak to things of which I do not know. And I wasn't there. I would imagine so, but who knows, right? The farm was maybe beautiful to a farmer, but it was, I mean, if you've never been to the Texas Panhandle, it was flat, it was dusty, and it was really cool in the spring, when the thunderstorm was rolling.
Yeah, springs are gorgeous.
Yeah, and we had what we call a subterráneo, which is Spanish for a cellar. And we would all descend into the cellar, a couple dozen times a year in the spring. When the tornadoes rolled in, my father and I would sit on the top steps watching the tornadoes skip across the fields, quarter mile away. Yeah,
only crazy. Someone who grows up around that does that, Jorge.
You don't care.
I lived in Tennessee for 2 years, but let me tell you, this California girl did not sit outside watching tornadoes skip. I was in my closet, converted into it. Yeah.
But it was cotton, and it was mostly cotton. But it was a lot of wheat, maybe corn. But it was farmland. That's what he liked, and I have pretty cool memories of waking up at 7, when I was 7, 8 years old, and going out with him to the fields. Back then, they had a lot of irrigation, and you would hear the hum of the irrigation was all night, and you'd go out and you'd check the ditches for breakage and whatever. And it was just the life of the farm. It was what he wanted, and it was taken away from him. Yeah.
People who live in that kind of climate, I think, really have an affinity. I have a friend who lives in New Mexico, and she absolutely loves it and is trying to encourage me to move out there. And I think it's just where your soul feels most alive and at peace. Thank you for sharing a bit of your history, because I'm curious if you could tell us about the Latino Justice, PRLDEF, and how you became involved with them as their national director, given you are based in Austin, Texas, and their main headquarters are in New York City.
Like you mentioned earlier, I was released in 2008, and I kind of climbed the professional ladder. I went back to school. I had a reputation in Austin as a poet and as an activist, but it was going to be difficult to get a professional position because I had not demonstrated a huge dependability before, because I'd gone back to prison twice. And so I went to school, got a master's, started going to the Capitol and testifying on my own on criminal justice issues, of which I knew quite a bit about prison conditions, parole stipulations. I'd written a book while I was down about prison, explaining the difference between policy and practice. And I came to the notice of some people at the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, Ana Correa, who ran it. And she ended up offering me a part-time position, and I just kind of went up from there to grassroots leadership, Center for Community Change, Prison Policy Initiative. And I got to know Juan Cartagena, who was the outgoing president after 10 years at Latino Justice. I'd seen him on panels across the country, and I think a couple of the times I came to his attention because I was speaking to my lack of bitterness. Well, I was determined to make a change in the criminal justice system, but always with the sense that questioning the validity of punishment, what purpose it has in our society, what purpose it has in our criminal justice system, the idea of redemption, the idea of forgiveness, and the certainties that we were building a criminal justice system based on exclusion, long-term prison for certain individuals convicted of certain crimes, who we were determined to punish, and other individuals who we felt, it's okay, we can let out, but those others need to be in there for the rest of their life. And the majority of those were people of color. So Juan and I got to talking, and he was in the midst of Latino Justice had always been a firm that litigated, that sued, that found areas that, or corporations or agencies or states or governments that discriminated against people of color, specifically Latinx, specifically the Puerto Rican communities on the East Coast, and had sued in order to level the playing field, right? Somewhat similar to what the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund in Texas did, what the NAACP has been doing historically. Of course, they were the model. And but Juan he realized that the organization, in order to thrive and grow, probably needed to find and elevate the voices of those who actually had been discriminated against by the criminal justice system, who had been criminalized, who had spent time in prison or in detention, and speak from that experience as a way to give validity, perhaps, to some of the aspirations that were bubbling up through Latino justice, right? Because he was seeing that while 25, 30 years ago, Latino justice was suing in order to get Puerto Ricans, opportunities within the police, opportunities within city sanitation departments, that within those positions, it was still, especially with police, of course, those individuals were still acting in ways that were oppressing their own communities. And he's like, what's going on there? There's something deeper at work here. What is it about the criminal justice system specifically that was resulting in people of color being disproportionately caught up in that system? And that he thought that he needed to find people who had been through that system. And so he and I just got to talking, and he said, look, if we ever have a spot, man, you should come talk to us. And when I left the Prison Policy Initiative, we just got to talking, and I went to work for them as the Southwest Region Director. And he and Jerónimo Saldaña, they're also at Latino Justice, who is also left now, had created something called Re-Envision Justicia. There was a collection of individuals across the country like Marisa Perez with Drug Policy Alliance, Ulises Hernandez with La Defensa in California, Lex Stepling, Jessica Sandoval, people who were working in the arena in different spaces within the Latinx arena and trying to empower individuals to lead movements to decrease the criminalization and the incarceration of our people. And he says, Jorge, that we think we need to go national. And by national, I don't mean that we're in every state, but that we needed to elevate the voice of the Latinx communities in Colorado. And while I'm not saying that they are, of course, elevating their own voices, they sometimes needed someone with some more reasons to come in and say, look, what y'all are doing has maybe been tried in Georgia and failed, but it was done in Pennsylvania and succeeded. So let us connect you. Let us find a way to bring you together in a convening. Let us try a way to support your search for resources. Let us maybe train the individuals who you have coming out of prisons who don't have policy chops but have really good ideas, and let us support you in that way. So that's kind of what my role is, to find, to identify, to elevate, to amplify the voices of the individuals from the Latinx community who've been criminalized and who've been oppressed, and as they seek leadership positions within organizations that are moving away from that paradigm.
Thank you for walking us through that and how your involvement came to be. And I am curious, my understanding is when someone is placed on parole that they have limited travel capabilities. Are you able to travel outside of the state of Texas?
Oh, yeah, but I still have to get my slave papers. I mean, I have to go to parole and I have to, say I want to leave the state. And I tell you what's really strange about it is I have to tell them before they give me permission. I have to tell them where I'm going. I have to give them the flight number where I'm going to stay, and then they will or will not grant me permission. They've only denied me once, and I forget what for. But of course, the money that had been spent on the hotel and the flight was lost. Texas lags behind a whole bunch of other states when it comes to criminal justice, as you probably know. But when it comes to the severity of the restrictions placed on someone who's on parole, it is not as bad as some states you would think they're a little more liberal, like, say, Massachusetts or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, totally. People in Massachusetts think because they were, the first people to allow gay marriage and everybody has a solar panel on the roof. That, oh, my God, look at us, we're liberal. But when it comes to criminal justice, no. They restrict the socializing between people who are on supervision and will, in fact, reincarcerate you if you do that. I went up there for a year, and I'd been out on parole 10 years already. And Texas had never put a monitor on me. I'll go to the Capitol. I founded a group of formerly incarcerated people called Texas Advocacy for Justice. And actually, a friend of mine founded it, and I came in right after, and I helped with the curriculum, but I took it over when they left. Anyway, Texas doesn't care. If you're on parole, you can go to the Capitol. They will, in fact, tap you for your expertise, a lot of the legislators. Jorge, tell me what's going on. They called me up. What's happening here? What does this mean? And 4 or 5 of us might be in a Capitol office. In Massachusetts, I got there. They immediately put me on a monitor, told me that I was a couple of hours from the Canadian border. I told them, well, I'd live a couple of hours from the Mexican border, and I have relatives, and I speak Spanish. So what's your point?
Why would I go to Canada?
Yeah, it's like, I don't know anybody in Canada, dude. But they don't like individuals who are on supervision hanging out with others. And I think that's a misreading of a sociological tenet that when they talk about, this is kind of esoteric here, but when they talk about the criminogenic factors that come into play when one goes back to prison, one thing that you should not do is be involved in antisocial activity, which is okay, I get that. But policymakers have taken that to the extreme by saying that anyone on supervision must inherently be involved in antisocial activity. So therefore, 2 of you together, you must be involved in some sort of criminality, and we're going to put you both back in prison. That's the way Massachusetts operates. And quite a few other states. There were something like 66,000 people returned to prison last year for what's called the association clause. People on supervision hanging out with other people on supervision, not having committed a crime. So, yeah. But anyway, that's kind of an aside.
Well, that's interesting because as opposed to looking at it, especially who you are and the work that you do, that perhaps you're actually mentoring or helping as opposed to up to, nefarious plans, if you will.
You would think so, and you are very likely coming from a liberal perspective that allows personal growth and transformation and humanity to everybody. People involved in the criminal justice system have a mindset that basically once you commit a crime, in fact, if you're suspected of committing a crime, you probably didn't, you've probably done others and we haven't found you. So we're just going to go ahead and keep our eyes on you for the rest of your life. And what they think is that you're just naturally going to be planning something, as you said, nefarious. I have pointed out to people that if the peer movement has any validity, if you are divorced and you want comfort from someone else who's been through the experience, you go to someone else who's been divorced, not someone who's been happily married for 50 years. The recovery paradigm is based mostly on the 12-step model, which is very much about someone in recovery knows best when it comes to dealing with someone else who's trying to go through recovery. That does not apply in the criminal justice arena. I'm sorry. It just doesn't.
I want to share a couple of quotes that I referred to in how I originally came to reach out to you. And the first one being, what would happen if you think the programs that are so necessary for someone to come out of prison rehabilitated were offered to that person before they went into prison? Wouldn't the value of those programs adhere to that individual and learn something from them? And then you went on and said, we are where we are in our criminal justice system because we failed to imagine anything other than what has been presented to us throughout our history, and that has been punishment. Those statements are very powerful, and there's definitely much work to be done to actualize a move away from the current system. So can you talk about how, through the work you're doing, both through Latino Justice, PRLDEF, and within the judicial system in Texas, the criminal system would look different?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here, a couple of premises that we have to look at first. And one is that there's a concept called rehabilitation that I have yet to have anyone define it well, right? Or how you arrive at the determination that someone is quote unquote rehabilitated. Rehabilitation before criminal justice was usually the concept usually of building a home or something, or a building. Oh, that home needs to be rehabilitated. It means return to its former state. It now is taken on the meaning of something within you that is evil or antisocial or whatever has been eradicated, or you've seen the error of your ways, and we have somehow quote unquote fixed you. And the only way we can determine that is if we catch you again in the criminal justice system. Because, of course, if you go back, you have not been rehabilitated, right? Because obviously you acted out again, even if that acting out was just by hanging out with one of your peers, who was also being successful and being a mentor for somebody else. It really has no meaning, but there is much validity. I mean, when people talk to me, you're talking to me, but you're not talking to the woman who I left flying on the floor tied in my shoelaces when I robbed the last time I went to prison. So I certainly did something to somebody that caused trauma, that caused pain, that person did not deserve, that was hurtful. And people say, well, you're not a bad person. You just made a mistake. No, that was much more than a mistake. I did something that was wrong. I made a choice to commit an act that transcended the boundaries that you and I placed between each other as civilized people. So we can get off into the esoteric of that I felt dehumanized or worthless because I've been raped and all this other stuff. But the point I'm making here is that there are people who commit acts that hurt other people, that are antisocial, for want of a better word. What do we want from those people? Do we want those individuals to gain some insight into the behavior, to see how their actions have hurt those people themselves, their communities? Do we want those people to make amends to their communities in a meaningful way? Do we want those people to be able to express to others their experience and use that experience as a way to stop them from doing it, or for them to also continue that path and transform themselves, right? So, I mean, this is leaving aside all the historical and ecological oppressions. And I don't mean ecological in the sense of greenery, but like ecosystems, right? Social ecosystems. Of course we want that. So is prison a place that is full of violence and misery and despair and cages that is meant to punish the place where you want people to go to that transformation? Is it conducive to that transformation? Because if not, then we're lying to ourselves by saying that's what we want. If that is really what we want, we would offer that to individuals. One, not only to the individuals who go through that experience, but we would realize that whatever we can identify that those individuals were missing in their life, or whatever we had put into their life through some sort of societal malaise, we would work on so that they would not go through that experience, and people would not experience that trauma. I can't tell you how many times I've heard who's a mom, who says, I'm glad that my son's in prison because one, I know where he is, and two, I think he's getting the help he needs. We have to put people into the most brutal, oppressive system we can think of in order to, one, thing that they're safe, in order to, two, the thing that they're getting help. Then that to me is a failure as a society. We have decided in the presence of everything that tells us otherwise that we can somehow say, you put this individual in a cage for 2 years, for 3 years, for 4 years, for 12 years, and that's what we want from them. And we're not really going to say about the program. We might give lip service to a quote unquote program that we think is going to be to their benefit, but we're not going to ask that program be validated. We're not going to ask for any sort of metrics from that program. We're not going to do whatever. We're going to rely on the parole board or whatever systems we have in place there to say, oh, okay, this person went to that program. They're ready to be let go. And then the only metric we have is whether or not that person goes back, knowing that the system itself profiles, places a much higher emphasis on individuals who already been in the system, somewhat skewing that anyway. So what would I'm sorry, that's a long way to get to what would it look like. It would look like the survivors of violence being much more involved in the process. And by that, I mean not being trotted out as mouthpieces for district attorneys who try to get the most time they can for a given individual for a given crime. Because the Alliance for Safety and Justice in 2016, 2017 did this great study asking survivors of violence, what do you want? They want for that person not to do it again. And given an array of possible alternatives, they came down against more time, against more prosecutors, against more punishment, for more public education, for more behavioral health models before people go to prison, all of that stuff. We would listen to them. We would listen to those who have been most intimately harmed by violence in our societies. And we would say, we would move away from basic incarceration to providing community-based models of prevention of behavioral and mental health services. And, and maybe have some sort of, I mean, in my mind, I break it up to something. I'm a single mom, and something has happened, and the father of my 3 kids is maybe incarcerated, and I'm at my wit's end with my kids. And before I do something crazy, before I do dope, before I get violent, I call this house down the street. It has 4 or 5 people sitting there, and they're kind of trained in this. And hey, let's go take care of your kids, and you come down here and talk to some other moms, and we take care of your kids for a night or something. Something that simple. I'm forever having conversation with folks in workshops, and I talk about how many of you have gone down the street and knocked on your neighbor's home and said, "Hi, here's who I am, and here's what I do, and how can I help you, and can we create a network of folks who call each other?" Nobody does that. They talk about it, but they don't really do it because they think, "Oh my God, they think I'm crazy." We don't, I mean, the quote unquote America of the 50s or whatever, the 40s, and where everybody knew their neighbors. I don't know if that ever existed, but I think it did in some sense.
I think so, yeah. I think it's very different now. And I think we need to move back
to that in a way. Yeah. I'm sorry, that was a long kind of more than what you wanted.
It's okay because it's huge. I mean, yeah. I listened to what you said and it resonated with me so much because it goes along with like preventative medicine.
Yeah.
And that's an awakening in our country. And speaking of survivors of violence, you mentioned your rape, which happened to you during your first arrest. And right. You were a young man. You were 20 years old, arrested on a first-time offense. Mm-hmm. First time in jail, not convicted of anything at that point, and yet put in a group of men who were then allowed to assault you. And so I'm curious, with your master's in social work, if part of your work, as you kind of alluded to, reaching out to like your neighbor, the woman down the street, is it reaching out to men young and old who have also experienced what you did? And are you in any way able to create resources or outlets for them to talk about their experience and get the help they need?
Not specifically. And in fact, that's probably something I should do. I have counseled a bunch of youth. I do, or I haven't done them in a couple of years, but I used to do a lot of healing circles, community building circles. And the healing circles were a lot with youth in detention, youth in probation, and we would do them based on indigenous principles of restorative justice. Right? And that's where I first got the courage. Just the first time I said to anyone about that, great, was in the healing circle. I had constructed this weird explanation for why I kept going back to prison and never really touching that rage and sense of worthlessness. I deserved it, or the way that people do who've been raped. No, I haven't. Again, I do talk to youth a lot, but I haven't sought out youth who have been affected in that way. I think there's a lot of people probably already doing that who are maybe, and I don't want to give more. I mean, I come from a community that talks about that formal training is not always a be all and end all of something, right? Just because
Right.
you have a
Yeah.
degree or,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot to be said for community healing and stuff. But I haven't sought that out. When I did come to the attention of Texas Association of Sexual Assault, TASSA, Texas Association of, I forget exactly what it is, but anyway, and they had done a video of me, and I'd done a video where they had my picture on buses around Austin and billboards, because they had this campaign about, and they were looking for men specifically because men don't admit to that, So I've got feedback from that, and I'm sure some people saw that, but I never took that into an area where I was actually looking to reach out to the community of individuals who've been raped and go to counsel them. There's other things that I do with my life, so I haven't sought that out.
That wasn't
Yeah.
to.
No, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. On February 7th, 2013, you went before the Senate Finance Committee to share your experience with finding housing and employment as a person on parole. And when you were released from prison, it took you 5 years to get a truck, 5 years to get an apartment. And I'm going to share another one of your quotes, if I may. Almost every right and every privilege that is designed to make our prisons more conducive to rehabilitation and to provide dignity to our offenders are the result of offender-initiated litigation. They are not the results of public policy or an administrator extending anything to an offender. And I'm wondering what we can do either in our individual communities or on a national level to get our policymakers and administrators to take a more proactive approach to both address the immediate needs and the long-term, hopefully not, but the long-term transformation of our prisons.
It's a good question. I think first we need to humanize individuals who've been incarcerated, not demonize them and not glamorize them. We tend to glamorize people like, oh my God, Tuki was a poet. And Jorge is a poet, so he's how cool that is. Or we go the other way. We think about the individual that said peeing on himself and, throwing a crap on the wall, defecating on the wall, and, throwing that at the guards who walk by, to one or the other. And we don't just humanize them. I think one is to humanize individuals who've been incarcerated. I think, and by that I mean there's a line of walk there when it comes to, you come from a system, you were profiled, there's a lot of stuff happened. But other than I have no idea what the percentage is of people who have not done anything whatsoever. We, at certain points in our life, make choices, right? Choices that are based on, more often than not, some sort of, not any sense of foundational morality, right? But our situational ethics. And those are usually selfish. Realize that people are human. And the way to do that is to, what you're doing now is to allow people to tell their story, encouraging people to tell their story in front of committees of power. There's a knot in one's gut when it comes to speaking power to those people who are sitting on that dais and in front of their little microphones, right? And we want to tend to thank them for allowing us to appear in front of them instead of saying, going the other way about it. Tend to do that. Elevate their voices. And again, without glamorizing, but centering them when it comes to policy. For a long time, when I was incarcerated, I would read things by Jeremy Travis and John Peter Celia, Shad Maruna, all these big names in the quote unquote penology, field of penology. And I'm wondering how much time have y'all done? How many rapes have you seen? How many people have you seen murdered? How many times have you been denied parole? How many times have you walked these halls, been beat up by a guard for stepping on the other line? What do you actually know about this? Y'all have to get involved a lot of times in policy arenas that shut out individuals from the people who committed certain crimes from certain fields, right? We have to get involved in fair chance initiatives that are not just ban the box, that don't just move the box, but actually provide some sort of standards when it comes to why you can't hire someone, what's the reason, how related is it to the field that you're pursuing. You have to get involved in that and support them. But ultimately, we've gone down to hearings here at the Capitol where there's 200 of us testified, just one against us, and we still lose. Because there is a perception that we have nurtured so long in this country that we deserve what we got. And until we can imagine something different, until we can actually, and that's one of the things that I have an argument with people who talk about expunction. And you know what expunction is, right? That's the legal removal of someone's criminal history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that it can't be brought up anymore. Well, it's never really erased, right? It's there somewhere. It exists. And I would rather live in a society, I would not want to live in a society where I had to always worry about who was going to be able to access my criminal history. I'd rather live in a society that saw past that, saw who I am today. I don't care about you not being able to access that, because that's who I was in 1992. That's who I was in 1991. Who was I in 2001, 2011, 2021? I'm a different person. Hopefully, I'm always growing. There's nothing specifically that one can say other than to humanize individuals, to try to listen to their experience and their narratives and give them credence, to hope to keep them accountable. A lot of times people get involved in movements and, oh, that person was incarcerated, so we don't maybe hold them accountable in certain ways that we hold other people accountable who haven't been, because whatever, we paternalize, we do whatever, right? But we don't hold them accountable. And by accountability, I mean authenticity, them holding compassion, whatever that we do to everybody else. We have to do that. There's not anything specific. I mean, well, there's policy work, of course, it needs to be done specific to the field, but they're just the basic human qualities of showing compassion and kindness to individuals and showing forgiveness and allowing people to redeem themselves that I think that we don't extend. You're asking me that, but would you be asking me that if I'd been convicted of a triple homicide, or if I'd been convicted of a child rape? Would I be here? Would I have elevated myself to the position that I have in Latino Justice? Would I even have been accepted into there, right? Because of that crime. And regardless of however one looks at that, if we believe in the concept that no life is disposable, that no human is disposable, that every human can have redemption, then that shouldn't make a difference. But it does. And are we moving toward that as, not forget the society, as individuals? I mean, you have to ask yourself that. We can't speak for society, we can only speak for ourselves. Are you moving toward that? Would you have had me here, right? Things of that nature. And how are we moving toward that? What are the conversations that we're having? Are we inviting people over to our house who have had this sort of stuff? Are we inviting them into our community? Are we actually not being paternalistic and patronizing toward them? Are we just treating them like we do everybody else? And if we treat everybody else shitty, then that doesn't matter. Let's try not to do that.
Well, we're just gonna equal opportunity.
People,
that's it.
I have to tell myself to get off my high horse.
It's really interesting that you say that, because it's perfectly ties in with my next question. You talk about forgiveness and redemption, and you touched on so many layers of conversation there. But I would imagine through everything you face, Jorge, and probably still face, a huge amount of fear, both from your imprisonment and in the work you do, or maybe not. Maybe not in the work you do, but I think of the importance of it and how that can be weighty at times and fearful of wanting to be successful. So basically what I'm trying to ask you is, what tools, what did you rely on? Did you rely on a particular faith that pulled you through all of that and sustains you now?
I don't know. This is hard work. This is soul sucking work, soul draining work. And just, even if I was just out laying concrete, as a former incarcerated guy, as a Latino in this state, parole will every now and then yank my chain, right? I'll go down the cap, or I'll publish an op-ed, or I'll tweet something directed at the TDCJ director. I'll get pulled back into parole. Oh, you got a random UA, or they'll pull me back on. Right now I'm on quarterly reporting, which means I go in every 3 months. Then they'll put me on monthly. My PO will say, who do you piss off, man? There's always that. And, I have nightmares. 13 years later, after leaving prison, I have nightmares 3 or 4 nights a week, still of violence, and 40-something years that I've been raped, I still have nightmares of that. So this is not something that's easy. And I wrote something a while back about nourishing my nightmares, that in order to be an effective advocate, one has to present a narrative that is compelling and moving and timely. And in order to that, it can't become rote. And if it's not rote, that means you have to live it over and over. You have to keep dredging in your spirit and your soul for that pain again, and show it over and over and over again. You have to be willing to do that. So I am in recovery, and it's been a process. I am moving toward, hopefully, a sense of spirituality. I've had intellectual quarrels with the concept of God most of my life. So I can't say that, oh, God has nourished me, or Jesus has kept me doing this, or Buddhism or whatever has kept me, whatever. I think I once asked myself if I was a sociopath or had sociopathic tendencies, and then I have a huge sense of empathy for folks. So from my understanding, that kind of kicks that out. But I am able to look at others who've been caught up in the system or who are on the cusp of getting caught up in the system and say, maybe there's something I can do to help you out of it. Maybe something that I've gone through can stop you from doing it. And I look back at that kid, who was thrown out in the street, didn't know what he was doing for 2 weeks. I walked from Beaver to Corpus Christi, which is about 60 miles the side of the road one day. About 2 days, I broke into a house and slept in the house and ate, and they just kept going. Not stealing, just because I didn't know what to do with myself. I was destroyed. I was lost. So if think of those people who were still in those sort of circumstances and how this world is not set up to help them. This world is set up to feed off them and thrive off them, and the securities of the world, and the GEOs of the world, or the private prisons of the world, and the governments who still thrive off slave labor of the world, and all those groups and organizations and agencies and people are set up to feed off that. And I don't think that those people are evil. I think that's what they've been taught. There is no other way. So I try to tell myself that I am not in control, that I can only do the best that I can every day, that I can only do the things that I can do, and that I tell God, or whatever the hell's out there, take this from me. I've done what I can, and hopefully it's good enough, man. That's all I can do.
One day at a time, right?
Basically, yeah. And that sounds very, in a way, oh my God, you're an AA cultish. But what's the difference between that?
There's no difference.
I mean, I was going to say, and being in the moment. The Eastern concept of mindfulness, being present and realizing that all you can do is in front of you right now. Forget what you did, forget what you're going to do. What are you doing right now? It's the same thing, right? But in the concept of recovery, in this country a lot, oh my God, you're the cult. And yet the same people will tell you, but be mindful.
And I didn't mean to cut you off on that. I thought you were going to relate it back to when you think of God's grace is true and new each day. Well, it's, and your daily manna, it's the day. It's not yesterday's. It's not tomorrow's.
Yes.
It's today. Yeah. And so that ties in with one day at a time. And I'm curious, Jorge, what makes you hopeful?
Not much right now in Texas.
Well, you need to get out of Texas.
Yeah. I don't know that I don't know. I am an optimist. I just really, really believe in the basic goodness of people. I think that people have been taught to operate out of selfishness and fear and anger and whatever. But I really think, when I see these kids, when I see these toddlers running around with each other, not having the hate or the fear or the hypocrisy or the discrimination or the prejudice that we show as adults, and still having that wonder. If we could just, everybody over like 3 would just leave it to the kids. I think they'd handle it. But
yes.
But really, youth give me hope. The fact that youth still are willing to fight and are fierce and are willing to, in the circles that I've done, sometimes I would, I'd have a circle and you'd have a kid off in the corner with a hoodie over their head, and I didn't care. And 3 weeks later, they would spit something back at me that I'd said 3 weeks before. They pay attention. Yeah. And a lot of them have had their heart and their spirits broken so many times by someone older and been so used. They retreat, but they are so welcoming of someone who just tells them the truth and says, I'm going to be here next week. And if not, I'll call you, let you know why I can. And, just something so simple as that. Yeah, I have faith and hope for those kids.
If there was a soundtrack to your life, what would be on it and why?
Oh my God, is that a question you ask everybody? That's one of these. We're going to get to something deep here with the music.
Yes, yes, it is something I have because, everyone's life experience is so unique and music is a huge part, at least, of my life. I always want to know what it means for someone else.
There'd be a lot of Little Joe. There's a band called Little Joe y La Familia. Joe Hernandez, out of Temple, Texas. It's a soundtrack of my life growing up when I was in high school. I went all the dances in South Texas, and Little Joe would surely be on it. Para la gente era album para la gente. Shout out to Little Joe.
Shout out to Little Joe.
Shout out to Little Joe. There'd be a lot of Marvin Gaye. What's going on album.
Very apropos for
it still hadn't changed.
For now,
some Credence. I spent a lot of time in prison and I listened to a lot of rap, but I didn't know who they were because we had 3 stations that had on the speaker was embedded in the wall, and they'd have one day with a soul station, one day with a country, or one day with a rock, and they would you didn't have access to it, and it was FM, so or whatever it was, you wouldn't know who the artist was, right? They would just go with the music. So there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of old country that I like, but there'd be a bunch of Little Joe in 70s and 80s rock.
Okay, everybody go check out Little Joe. I'll have this in your show notes, but I want you to tell people how they can get a hold of you.
They can call me. No.
Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah. Learn that the ones most likely to call you and get in touch with you are the ones who really hate anything you're saying. And that's not always true, because this has been a timeline. Other stuff I did led to PBS, led to you, They can always email me at jrenaud, that's RENAUD, at latinojustice.org. They want to have a conversation, they can do that. They're always welcome to do that. They can look me up on Facebook or send me a message. I'm on there, Jorge Antonio Renaud. They can look up Latino Justice on the website, look at the staff, and find me if they forget.
Okay. And again, I will definitely have it in your show notes. And one of the things that we haven't touched upon is your poetry. And I would love for you to read a bit of your poetry before we say goodbye, if you wouldn't mind doing that.
No, that's cool. When I started really writing not for publication, even though I did get pretty mercenary there for a while, my last few years in prison, I found out that there were places that would pay me because I was pretty good. I was kind of mercenary there toward the end, and I found out that I could get money for my poetry. So I was putting out stuff and winning contests and wasn't really honing the craft. And I think I've gotten back into the craft. I was thinking a few months back that one of the phrases that I've heard most in the last year was, "You're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute." And of course, putting that in a social context, social justice context, is that many of the people who I've known and grown up with in my communities have always been muted. They've never had a voice. So I wrote this thing, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself and unwind the gag they have placed over your lips. And don't listen to those who try to regulate your existence to a hashtag, some rhythmic, despotic, historically sweet sound bite that reduces his stories to a citation in somebody else's textbook. Unmute yourself. Fling away the muzzle they have tied around your mouth and proceed to violently sing and screech. Ain't no calm preaching here. No beseeching. We've had enough of that begging, believing in the system being nice shit. Unmute yourself and claw away the laws they shove down your throat, trying to limit where and when and how you can vote in their desire to reignite the cooling embers of the dying fires of their exclusivity, of their members-only clubs built upon the wretched whiteness of the bewigged judgments of all that is right and just. Unmute yourself. Clear away the fog, the doubt, the fright, the fear that they might have to fear and hear and be offended by some less than humble demands come tumbling out straight from your gut, up through your unclogged throat, and finally loosen your unmuted voice after centuries of strangulation.
Thank
I think
you.
I stumbled on that a couple of times.
I wouldn't know that, Jorge.
That's the thing about a poet when you're reading.
Yes.
You forget they don't know, so yeah.
And performers, if you will, always know where they've always. And yet you obviously left me speechless to where I was taking in what you were saying, and I really appreciate you not only sharing that, but sharing a bit of your story and your time and being willing to join me today, Mr. Jorge Antonio Renaud. And to say that I wish you success, I actually wish that the work you're doing wouldn't be necessary anymore.
Really? That's what we hope,
That's
right?
my hope for you. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we say goodbye?
Can I read another poem?
Absolutely.
You sure?
Yes. It's my podcast, Jorge.
Okay, it's your podcast. Okay, here you go.
Yeah.
When she was 15, my mother walked through the river of her nightmares, her dress bunched over her thighs, her shame abandoned to the liberating breeze of her survival, and the mud fell from her mouth in clumps as she struggled up the banks of the Rio Bravo to begin the rest of her life. When she was 15, my mother floated across the river on a raft she had ripped from the trees of San Luis Potosí. The clawing fingers of her destitution left behind in the wake of the waves churned by her furious feet. When she was 15, my mother mounted a mule and she splashed across the river. Its hooves cracked and bloody from its flight across the Sierra Madre Oriental del Estado Libre y Soberano de Zacatecas. And as they stopped in midstream, the stink of the silver mines had claimed the bones of her family was washed away, as she urged her mule into the desiccating dream of southern Texas. When she was 15, my mother gripped the top of a swaying boxcar as it screamed across the Mexican plains. Her hair on fire from the cinders sprayed by the ancient steam engine as the train trundled and screeched, slowed by the weight of the nameless niños clinging to its iron sides as they fled the insane rage of Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. As they roared across the border, their brittle fingernails finally gave way, and they fell, one by one, their sighs unlamented, their soft bodies rolling into the lush land of their aspirations. When she was 15, my mother was herded onto a cattle truck, a convoy of cattle trucks, 1,000,000 cattle trucks packed with brown-skinned paisanos, all of them driven northward, their eyes clenched shut as they imagined streets of gold, as they dreamed of honey flowing from the lips of the light-skinned, praises pouring from their manicured mouths, and a sly welcome in their well-dressed pose. And when the cattle trucks were waved to a stop, and they were hurried into the orchards, into the factories, onto the farms, when the iron clicked close around their wrists, when their fists unclenched and they became pliant, when the stench of the American promise filled their heads, they prayed to serpent and owl, to turtle, eagle, and wolf. And as their ancestors had done before them, they statued themselves still, and they wait for a promise yet to be filled.
Thank you, Jorge. Very, very much.
Very well.
I'd also like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic. BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallbone, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Thank you again for joining me today. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com. Visit my website at soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at Cheryl Halling VO. I look forward to sharing more stories on the next episode of 19 Stories From Fear to Hope. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.